And once that name appeared, the silence around it became louder than any headline could have been. Because adding a name doesn't close a question. It opens a trail, and Janet Arnold wasn't just a footnote. She was a doorway into records that had never been meant to be connected to a royal narrative. Records that lived quietly in county archives, census rolls, hospital registries, and burial logs that don't care about fairy tales or public image. They care about dates, locations, and biological truth. And as researchers quietly began following that trail, what they noticed first wasn't scandal. It was inconsistency, timelines that didn't align cleanly, movements that raised eyebrows, and gaps that mirrored the same kind of silence that had already followed Meghan into adulthood. Because according to available documents, Janet Arnold's life intersected with institutions and locations that were never publicly acknowledged, including periods where records go dark entirely. No address, no employer, no family listed, just absence. And absence in official paperwork doesn't mean nothing happened. It usually means something happened that someone didn't want recorded. And that realization is where the story stops being about fashion, weddings, or optics and starts becoming about protection. Because families don't erase grandparents unless there's a reason. And institutions don't allow genealogical blanks unless those blanks serve a purpose. And when people close to the situation were quietly asked why Doria sat alone at that wedding, the answers were always carefully vague, phrased as estrangement, complexity, distance, but never denial. Never correction, never clarity. And that's important. Because when something isn't true, institutions rush to disprove it. But when something is inconvenient, they manage it. And managing doesn't look like confrontation, it looks like silence. It looks like letting one woman sit alone in front of the world so no one asks why no one else is there. It looks like hoping the moment passes before curiosity turns into investigation. But curiosity did turn into investigation. Because the timing of that name appearing wasn't random. It happened after the wedding, after the vows, after legitimacy had already been symbolically sealed. And that sequence matters. Because once the public accepts a narrative emotionally, correcting it later becomes almost impossible. And that's when the theory begins to harden into something more unsettling. The idea that the truth wasn't hidden because it was explosive, but because it complicated lineage, identity, and belonging in ways the monarchy does not negotiate with publicly. And suddenly the focus shifts back to Doria, the woman who never spoke out, never explained, never corrected the record, never filled in the blanks herself. And that silence is not weakness, it's discipline. Because people who know where the lines are don't cross them, they respect them. Especially when crossing them would destabilize the very future their child just married into. And this is where the emotional weight of the story settles. Because if Doria knew, if Meghan knew, if the palace knew, then every decision after that wedding wasn't just about optics. It was about containment. About keeping a past from colliding with a future that had already been sold to the world as historic. And once you see it through that lens, so many moments take on new meaning. The controlled distance from extended family, the repeated emphasis on independence, the insistence on rewriting narratives rather than clarifying them, the defensiveness around questions that should have been easy to answer. Because easy truths don't require protection, but fragile ones do. And what makes this story so powerful isn't that it claims something outrageous. It's that it explains something familiar, the discomfort people felt but couldn't name. The image of a single woman seated alone while the world applauded. The sense that something essential was missing from a celebration that was supposed to represent unity. And once that seed is planted, it doesn't need proof to grow. It grows because it fits too neatly, because it explains too much. And because history has shown us again and again that when institutions choose silence over clarity, it's rarely because there's nothing to say. It's because saying it would change everything that comes after. And that's why this story refuses to go away. Because it isn't chasing scandal, it's chasing coherence. And until the blanks are explained, the silence will keep asking the question no one wants to answer out loud. And this is where part 2 deepens. Not by adding accusations, but by tightening the logic around the silence itself. Because once a blank space is filled, the next question is never who was added. It's why they were there in the first place. And insiders familiar with how royal vetting actually works will tell you that nothing about a senior royal marriage proceeds casually. Every background is examined not once but repeatedly. Not just for scandal but for structural risk. For anything that could later destabilize perception, legitimacy, or narrative continuity. And that's why the timing of disclosure matters more than the disclosure itself. Because information released after a wedding carries a very different weight than information released before it. And once that door closed at Windsor, the story was effectively locked in. Meaning anything unresolved would have to be managed quietly rather than corrected publicly. And that management often looks like emotional distance rather than factual denial. Because denial invites proof, while distance discourages questions. And that pattern appears again and again in the months that followed. From the carefully limited public role of Doria to the absence of extended family references, to the way Meghan herself began reframing her identity less around lineage and more around self-definition, independence, and reinvention. Themes that feel empowering on the surface but also serve a practical purpose when history becomes complicated. Because self-authorship allows you to step away from inherited narratives without explaining why. And this is where the emotional tone of the story shifts. Because if this were simply about embarrassment or estrangement, clarity would have solved it, but clarity never came. And clarity is usually the easiest path when nothing fundamental is at stake. Yet here, the path chosen was silence layered on top of silence, punctuated only by carefully timed disclosures that arrived after they could no longer change outcomes. And that strategy tells us more than any document ever could. Because people protect what they believe still has power to harm. Not what is harmless. And once Meghan entered the royal system, the rules governing harm became much stricter, not because of cruelty, but because monarchy functions on continuity, not confrontation, and when continuity is threatened. Even indirectly, the system doesn't explode. It absorbs, it smooths edges, it narrows exposure, and it waits for time to do what statements cannot. And that waiting game explains why years later, questions still hang unresolved, not because answers don't exist, but because acknowledging them would reopen a chapter the institution has already moved past. And that's the quiet tragedy at the heart of this story. Because silence isn't always imposed, sometimes it's agreed upon. Sometimes it's chosen as the least damaging option available. And if that's the case here, then the image of Doria sitting alone wasn't neglect. It was containment, not punishment, but positioning. A visual boundary drawn not out of malice, but necessity. And once you accept that possibility, the entire narrative reads differently, not as scandal, not as conspiracy, but as a collision between personal history and institutional survival, where no one wins loudly and no one loses publicly, but everyone carries the weight privately. And that's why this story still unsettles people, because it doesn't accuse, it explains. And explanations are far more dangerous than rumors, because they give silence a shape, and once silence has a shape, it can no longer pretend to be empty.